James Barkley had never been one to chase admiration or attention. In fact, he had spent most of his life doing quite the opposite, working quietly, keeping to himself, avoiding unnecessary fuss. That was just how he was wired. After retiring early from a decades-long stint in warehouse logistics, he had enough saved to walk away from city noise and settle somewhere quieter, somewhere real. He'd bought a house at the edge of a modest residential area on the outskirts of a town that didn't make the news. He wasn't looking for a second wind or a late-life adventure. He just wanted control over his own space, his own time, and the air he breathed. The house was nothing fancy but the land. It had potential. There was something deeply satisfying to James in the idea that he could take raw earth, wood, and stone and shape it into something meaningful with his own two hands. That was more than a pastime. It was a statement. On his third month in the house, after cutting back the overgrown blackberry bushes and clearing a sunlit patch near the back fence, James began building a log grill. Not some aluminum box with a plastic hood that rattled in the wind, but a proper fire-fed structure. Part outdoor hearth, part tribute to his late father, who used to grill hickory-smoked ribs every 4th of July, no matter the weather. James remembered those days well. The smell of burning wood, meat sizzling over flame, his father's rough hands brushing ashes off his jeans. There was nothing more American to James than standing over your own fire with food you seasoned yourself. Building the grill became a kind of meditation. He sourced reclaimed brick from a demolition site 30 miles out and bought aged cedar logs from a local who had no idea how valuable the grain was. It took him 5 weeks, not counting weather delays and evenings spent reshaping the base with a chisel and raw determination. When it was finally finished, the structure stood just under 5 feet tall, its firebox surrounded by carefully laid stone, the chimney arched back slightly to guide the smoke upward and away. It looked like it belonged there, tucked against the back corner of his yard under a branchy oak, visible just enough to catch the sunset in its metal. That night he fired it up for the first time, using a modest bundle of dry pecan wood and a thick cut of beef he'd picked up from a butcher in town who still called him Sir. The meat sizzled perfectly, the smell of open flame curling through the cool dusk air like something sacred. James sat back in a folding chair and let the heat from the fire ease into his chest, feeling more at home than he had in years. He was mid-bite into that steak, chewing slowly as the stars began to emerge in the blackening sky, when he heard it, the soft electric hum of a golf cart approaching from the direction of the main road. He tilted his head slightly, listening. He hadn't invited anyone, hadn't spoken to many neighbors beyond a few nods and brief comments about the weather. The cart slowed just outside his back gate, a squat white vehicle with a beige top and chrome side mirrors that flashed once in the firelight. The woman driving it didn't honk or call out. She simply pulled up and sat there for a moment, the headlights illuminating James's grill from the side like a stage prop. He stood slowly, not annoyed, just curious. As he approached, the woman opened the cart door and stepped out with mechanical precision, like every movement had been planned in advance. She was maybe in her late 50s, dressed in an immaculately pressed lavender blouse and a floral scarf that looked like it had never touched real wind. Her hair was styled high with the kind of volume that required more than one brush. She wore a badge on her hip, not a law enforcement badge, something laminated, clipped to her belt like an office ID. She didn't introduce herself. She looked past James toward the grill, and wrinkled her nose as though she were staring at something offensive rather than a perfectly constructed cooking structure. Then, in a voice that was all authority and no warmth, she said, "You're aware this neighborhood adheres to regional air quality directives, aren't you?" James blinked once. "You mean the state fire bans? This isn't one of those days." "No," she said sharply. "I'm referring to sectional guidance. the guidelines set by our community group for combustion-based installations. Smoke particulates from untreated firewood, especially in an open system like this, can significantly affect the respiratory comfort of surrounding homes. James stared at her for a long moment. I'm on my own property. And yet, she replied with a rehearsed smile, you're part of a larger air ecosystem. This kind of installation, I'm afraid, will need to be documented and reviewed. We'll need to verify compliance. Compliance with what? He asked, his voice still calm but laced with steel now. There's no fire ban. There's no ordinance here against wood grills. I checked that before I even laid the foundation. There are internal assessments that go beyond city code, she replied smoothly. They're community-driven. It's not about legality. It's about standards. James exhaled slowly, not responding. He didn't like where this was going, but he also didn't like giving people what they wanted, especially when what they wanted was control. The woman looked at him for a moment longer, then turned back toward her cart. We'll be in touch, she said, before slipping behind the wheel and driving off without another word. The soft whir of the engine faded into the night. James stood there in silence for a while, the grill crackling behind him. Something in him tightened. Not fear, but a deep instinct that told him things weren't going to stay simple. He didn't know exactly what the woman meant by internal assessments, and he didn't yet care. But he knew the tone. He'd heard it before, in human resources, in board meetings, in city permit lines. It was the tone of someone who wasn't there to protect peace, but to enforce it on their terms. He finished his meal quietly that night. The fire burned lower as the moon rose overhead, casting long silver shadows across the lawn. Somewhere behind him, the grill let out a final pop of sap in the log, and James glanced back toward the empty street behind his gate. He didn't know the woman's name. She hadn't offered it, but she had looked at his creation, this thing he'd poured his time and care into, as though it were some kind of contamination. That told him all he needed to know. He stood for a long while after the embers died down, watching the darkness press closer. He wasn't sure what exactly she intended to do, but one thing he knew for certain. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be the last time he saw her. Not by a long shot. The following morning started like most others. James was up before 7. The kind of man who woke up not because he had to, but because that's just how the body worked when you spent a lifetime on schedules and structure. He brewed his coffee on the stovetop, black and bitter, and stepped out onto the back porch to feel the early sun cut through the crisp air. The grill sat silently in its place, darkened now but dignified, like a monument to something unspoken. For a moment, James forgot the strange visit from the woman the night before. It felt like a hiccup in what was otherwise a quiet, deliberate life. That feeling lasted exactly 10 minutes. It ended the moment he approached the front gate and saw a manila envelope propped against it, held in place by a small rock. There was no name, no return address, just the word "Notice" typed in large block letters across the front. James bent down, picked it up, and opened it carefully. Inside was a printed letter on a letterhead he didn't recognize, with an embossed seal and several pages of what appeared to be regulatory jargon. It referenced something called the Community Environment Oversight Group, and listed citations from documents James had never seen. The tone was formal, excessively so, and every paragraph was designed to sound more authoritative than the last. In between the legalese, the message was clear. His grill had been flagged as a localized emissions anomaly and subject to urgent review for public health compliance. No name signed it. No contact number. Just a line at the bottom stating that non-cooperation may result in administrative consequences. James reread the letter 3 times. Each pass made him more annoyed. He wasn't a fool. He knew boilerplate intimidation tactics when he saw them. What caught his attention more than anything, though, was the mention of an emissions record. It implied that someone had already begun documenting his property, measuring or monitoring in ways he hadn't authorized or even been told about. That was more than overreach. That was intrusion. And intrusion wasn't something he tolerated. By early afternoon, James had driven to the county office building in town, carrying the letter with him in a folder tucked under his arm. The receptionist at the planning and zoning desk was polite but confused when he showed her the envelope. She scanned the documents, flipped them over, and finally admitted she'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't county-issued, she said, nor state. She asked him to wait while she called someone in records. 15 minutes later, a slightly older man with a weathered face and a calm voice came out from the back office. He took one look at the letter and said, "This ain't ours. I don't know who's running that seal, but it's not from this building." He pointed to the bottom corner of the page. "See that? That's a private identifier. Some neighborhoods hire third-party firms to enforce their own rules, usually gated communities, though. Not this area." James left the office more irritated than when he'd arrived. If this wasn't official, then it was being made to look that way on purpose. Someone had gone through the trouble of manufacturing legitimacy, using fake headers, invented language, and regulatory theater to scare him into compliance. But with what? There were no actual rules in this neighborhood that prohibited outdoor wood grills. He knew that for a fact. He'd reviewed the zoning guidelines before he'd built the damn thing. And now, suddenly, there were notices appearing overnight, delivered without signature or explanation. It didn't add up. That night, James installed a motion sensor on his front gate. It was a simple device, the kind you could pick up at a hardware store for $20. It synced to a basic app on his phone and sent silent alerts whenever someone approached the perimeter. He wasn't interested in surveillance. He just wanted to know when people were trespassing on his land. He also began taking photographs of everything: the grill, the fence line, even the mailbox. A part of him felt ridiculous, but he'd learned long ago that the only way to protect yourself was to keep records. Paper didn't forget, and pictures didn't argue. The next morning brought something even stranger. As he walked around the side of the house with a cup of coffee in hand, James noticed something tucked under the latticework near the foundation. He crouched down, careful not to spill, and pulled out a small cardboard box. Inside was a pile of dried leaves and sawdust. On top sat a folded piece of paper with a single sentence printed in red ink. "This is what we breathe." No signature. No logo. Just a statement. A message, really. James stared at it for a long time. He didn't feel threatened, exactly, but there was a chill under his skin that hadn't been there before. Someone had come onto his property, again, not to steal, not to vandalize, but to deliver a message. That was worse. That was personal. He contacted a local attorney that afternoon. Her name was Carolyn Rivers, recommended by a neighbor he vaguely trusted. She wasn't dramatic or flashy, just competent. James explained the situation in simple terms, showed her the documents, the photos, the box. She read everything in silence, nodding slowly, asking only the occasional clarifying question. After a few minutes, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is classic soft pressure. Someone's trying to bully you off your property rights without using legal force. That way, they can't be accused of violating anything because technically they haven't. Yet." James asked what his options were. "For now," Carolyn said, "we document everything. I'll file an inquiry with the city to confirm there are no pending environmental regulations. Then I'll send a certified letter to this so-called oversight group requesting legal identification. If they ignore it, they lose standing. If they reply, we get something traceable, Either way, they're exposed. James nodded. That was what he needed. Not confrontation, but clarity. Not escalation, but a line in the sand drawn with law and logic. But just when he thought the situation was beginning to make sense, it took a sharper turn. The following evening, while grilling a small rack of ribs, James heard a noise that stopped him mid-flip. It was the sound of metal on metal. Quick, sharp, purposeful. He stepped toward the fence and saw nothing at first. Then he looked down. Someone had tampered with the gate hinge. A thin length of wire, looped tightly, was threaded through the bolt, holding it just slightly ajar. Subtle. Ingenious. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were paying attention. It wouldn't keep the gate open, but it would prevent it from locking. It was a message. Another one. A silent one. And it meant someone had been back. James didn't sleep much that night. He didn't pace or panic. He just lay still, eyes open, listening. Not for footsteps, for patterns. Because this wasn't just about a grill anymore. It was about territory. And someone was telling him, without saying a word, that he didn't control his own. He woke early and made 2 decisions. The first, he would no longer leave his grill unattended. It wasn't paranoia. It was precaution. The second, he was going to see if any of his other neighbors had received similar notices. Not to build an alliance. Not yet. But to learn. Because whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting him randomly. And if he wasn't the only one, that changed everything. By the 3rd week, James no longer operated on assumptions. What had begun as a quiet life centered around rebuilding his home and enjoying the small rituals of his daily routine had now evolved into a steady stream of tension and watchfulness. He had never been paranoid by nature. He believed in facts, in evidence, in patterns you could document and explain. But what he was now facing didn't move openly or declare itself outright. It crept, lingered, and retreated, just enough to remain deniable. And that made it more dangerous. It was early Thursday morning when the motion sensor tripped again. James had grown used to the alerts, but this one came earlier than usual, just past 4:20 a.m. He stepped out onto the back porch in silence, coffee untouched on the counter, and scanned the yard. No footprints, no trash left behind. But something felt off. It wasn't until the sun rose that he noticed the pattern in the gravel near his fire pit. A boot mark, lightly pressed, walking toward the fence. Just one. He photographed it, labeled the file by date and time, and backed it up to 2 drives. Not because he planned to do anything with it yet, but because every inch of record was now a shield, and shields mattered. The escalation was subtle, methodical, and deliberate. Later that same day, James walked out to collect his mail and found a note wedged between 2 coupons in his box, printed on the same type of stock paper as the first envelope. No envelope this time. No formal tone. Just one line in bold sans serif. Repeat emissions will be classified as intentional. The message was ambiguous, but the implication was crystal clear. Someone had determined that James's grill was now not merely a nuisance, but a provocation. That was no longer about community health or misguided environmental concern. That was about control, domination through regulation. And James had no interest in playing by those invisible rules. That afternoon, he visited the town's records department again, this time requesting the parcel history on his property and the public records of any neighborhood planning boards operating within the jurisdiction. The clerk, a young man with too much gel in his hair and not enough patience, handed him a file with minimal commentary. As James sifted through it, something caught his attention. 6 years ago, a non-governmental advisory committee had attempted to form in his neighborhood, a coalition of homeowners trying to impose standardized property rules under the guise of community-driven enhancements. The committee was voted down at the time, but one of the names on the application form stuck out to him. Karen L. Thatcher. There it was, in plain type. The woman with the lavender blouse, the clipped voice, the artificial smile, she had a paper trail. James took the form home, scanned it, and began creating a map. Not of names and addresses, but of influence. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with an opinion. She was someone who had tried, and failed, to institutionalize her control over the neighborhood, and now seemed to be doing it through pressure and bureaucracy, piece by piece, house by house. James didn't confront her. He didn't need to. Confrontation without leverage was just noise. Instead, he focused on tightening his perimeter. He replaced the gate lock with a heavy-duty, steel-reinforced model. He added a second motion sensor, this time near the tree line. He bought floodlights with motion triggers and tested them at night to make sure they activated silently and evenly. No part of this was paranoia. This was procedure. He had seen how small power structures worked, how they tested boundaries, escalated gradually, and fed on silence. But James was done being silent. 3 nights later, the test came. Around midnight, the motion lights flared on, flooding the backyard in white. James moved quickly but quietly to the rear window, eyes scanning for movement. He spotted it immediately. A figure ducking behind the oak near his grill. Not rushing, not vandalizing, just watching. James didn't shout. He didn't grab a weapon. He picked up his phone and called the local sheriff's office, reporting a trespasser with a calm, precise description. It took them 14 minutes to arrive. By then, the figure had disappeared. The deputies did a brief sweep, noted no signs of forced entry, and left with a shrug and a vague promise to increase patrols. James didn't expect more. He wasn't trying to be rescued. He just wanted the incident on the record. The next day, the situation shifted again, but this time not on his property. As James returned from a trip to the lumber yard, he noticed a new sign staked into a neighbor's lawn 4 houses down. It was professionally printed, clean design, laminated to resist weather. Clean air zone, smoke-free commitment. Below that, in smaller text, supported by Neighborhood Partners for Health. Another euphemism, another front. That was how it always began. Voluntary participation, with silent implications for those who didn't join. He knocked on the neighbor's door, a middle-aged couple he'd only spoken to once before. The wife answered, startled but polite. When James asked about the sign, she fumbled for an explanation. Karen came by, said it would be good for community health, just temporary. A gesture, you know? James nodded, thanked her, and left. A gesture. Of course. Later that week, James received a certified envelope delivered directly to his door. It was from the so-called Neighborhood Environmental Advisory Review Committee. Another new name, another fake office. But this time, they attached a preliminary notice of regulatory review. They claimed to have received multiple complaints about persistent combustion emissions from his property and that he was now under review for potential sanctions. It wasn't legal, yet, but it was designed to look like it was. The letter was accompanied by a voluntary remediation plan that suggested he disassemble his grill and replace it with a compliant alternative, such as an electric unit or sealed gas system. James didn't respond. He didn't argue. Instead, he sent everything to Carolyn Rivers, who by this point was archiving each document and compiling a detailed chronology. She sent her own letter in reply, formal, legally grounded, and assertive. It demanded immediate clarification on the jurisdiction of this committee, requested the identities of those involved, and warned that continued harassment would be considered a civil violation under state nuisance and property interference statutes. Oh, there was no response. And then the real damage began. James woke one morning to find the grill covered in a thick, gelatinous substance, sticky, pungent, clearly synthetic. Some kind of deterrent compound sprayed across the stone like marking paint. Whoever had done it knew what they were targeting. He filed a report with the sheriff's office again, but they could only log the incident as vandalism with no suspect. James cleaned it himself, stone by stone, scrubbing until his knuckles bled raw. He said nothing, posted nothing. But inside, something shifted. The following day, he walked the perimeter of his property and made a discovery that left him speechless. Small plastic stakes, red-tipped, numbered, had been driven into the soil in regular intervals along the rear edge of his lot. Survey markers, unauthorized, unfiled. Someone was attempting to remap his property lines without any legal basis. James dug one of them up, took it inside, and placed it on his workbench like evidence. He didn't know yet what it meant, but he understood the message. You don't own what you can't defend. That night, James didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, maps spread out before him, phone silent, mind turning. He wasn't just up against a neighbor with an axe to grind. He was up against someone building a system of power. One letter, one complaint, one quiet step at a time. And if he didn't push back, it would never stop. The threshold came not in the form of an attack, but in the quiet presence of something that didn't belong. On a cool morning, James stepped into his yard and found a small black device staked into the ground 3 feet from his grill. A cylinder no larger than a flashlight, partially buried, but with a tiny blinking light near the top. It looked industrial, not consumer grade with no markings, no branding, no tag. He stared at it, crouched beside it, and realized what it was. An air sensor. Someone had placed a live particulate monitor on his property. Not nearby. Not at the fence, on his soil. The breach wasn't symbolic anymore. It was physical, deliberate, and unmistakably invasive. He didn't touch it. He photographed it from all angles, then called Carolyn Rivers. She arrived 40 minutes later with her briefcase and a clipboard. They stood over the device together in silence before she crouched, used a tissue to lift the base, and placed it gently in a plastic evidence bag. She didn't offer an opinion until they were back inside, where James made coffee without a word. "This," she said finally, "is what turns a nuisance into a case. This is surveillance, unauthorized data collection on private land. If you wanted to escalate this now, we could." James said nothing. He didn't like the idea of escalation. It wasn't his nature to fight on someone else's timeline. But he understood leverage, and this changed the scale of the game. Carolyn filed a formal notice of trespass and tampering, attaching photos, time-stamped sensor readings, and a notarized affidavit. But it would take time. Due process always did. In the meantime, James turned his attention to the neighborhood. He had spent weeks avoiding direct engagement with other residents, preferring to keep his distance and observe quietly. But that morning, he walked the cul-de-sac, passing lawns that looked just a little too trimmed, porches with identical planters, garbage bins rolled to the curb with robotic precision. It wasn't just neat. It was curated, controlled. He knocked on 3 doors. 2 went unanswered. The third opened just a crack, an elderly man with tired eyes who recognized James but didn't speak first. When James asked if he'd received any similar letters or visits about his yard or equipment, the man hesitated, then shook his head. Not denial. Fear. And then he said, almost in a whisper, "I had a porch smoker. They said it was a fire risk. Then I had to sign a compliance thing to keep my insurance." He looked around nervously, then added, "They always start with one person." James thanked him and left. He didn't need details. He had confirmation. What was happening to him had happened before, and the method was always the same. Isolate, pressure, wear down, force conformity not by direct order, but through slow erosion of confidence. But James wasn't most people. He wasn't going to give up the grill or the ground it stood on. He called a private technician the next day, an environmental systems specialist from a nearby city who did freelance air quality inspections. The man arrived 2 days later, neutral and professional, and spent the afternoon setting up his own equipment: carbon filters, particulate sensors, a thermal imager. He tested the grill during use, logged wind direction, sampled ambient air at the edges of the property line. When he was done, he handed James a preliminary statement. No elevated particulate levels, no trace pollutants above standard residential thresholds, no evidence of hazard. "You burn clean," he said. "Whoever's making noise about your setup doesn't understand airflow. Or they don't care." That same evening, James delivered a copy of the report to Carolyn, who attached it to her growing file and submitted a copy to the sheriff's office along with an update to the vandalism complaint. James also printed a copy for himself and posted it in a weather-sealed frame next to the grill. Nothing flashy, just facts on paper, on record, in view. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a reminder. If someone wanted to push him, they would have to do it openly and in the presence of truth. But Karen didn't respond directly. That wasn't her way. Instead, her method changed. The visits stopped. The letters paused. Even the motion sensors were quiet for 5 full days. For a moment, James wondered if the storm had passed, if the grill had finally become invisible again. And then the knock came. It was just after dusk. He opened the door to find a man in a blue dress shirt, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand. Early 40s, clean cut. Too casual to be official, too formal to be neighborly. "Evening," the man said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm with Community Compliance Advisory. We're performing follow-ups on pending notices. Would you mind answering a few questions about your installation?" James didn't invite him in. "Do you have a warrant or appointment?" "No need," the man replied smoothly. "This is just informal documentation. Then you'll understand if I decline." The man tilted his head slightly. "Of course, but just so you're aware, refusal to engage with compliance outreach may reflect negatively in your file." James stepped forward, voice calm. "You're standing on private property. I'm asking you to leave." The man didn't argue. He didn't push. He smiled again, nodded once, and turned back toward the sidewalk, tapping something into his tablet as he walked. James watched him go, then closed the door and locked it. And as he stood there in silence, he realized what had shifted. They weren't trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to document his resistance, to build a case, not for law, but for narrative, and James had no intention of letting them write it for him. That night, Carolyn filed a cease and desist letter citing repeated, unacknowledged boundary violations, unlicensed surveillance, and coordinated nuisance activity. She submitted it to the same agency name on the clipboard, Community Compliance Advisory, though she knew it wouldn't go far. These weren't real agencies. They were shells, names. They existed only to intimidate and delay. But still, every letter became part of the foundation, a legal architecture that could, when the time came, hold weight. The middle point of the battle came not with fire, not with confrontation, but with a kind of clarity. James now saw the strategy laid bare. The harassment wasn't designed to win. It was designed to exhaust, to make the grill feel not worth the trouble, to bleed him in hours, attention, and peace of mind. But it had failed, because now James wasn't fighting for a grill. He was fighting for the idea that he could stand on his own land, light his own fire, and not apologize for it. James didn't know what he expected when the cease and desist letter was delivered, but he had held out a thread of hope that it might change the tone, slow the tide, give him some breathing room. It didn't. In fact, within 48 hours of its filing, the situation intensified in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not louder, not more aggressive, but quieter, more layered, more precise. The first sign came in the form of a letter slipped under his door while he was in the backyard. A single page printed in perfect black ink with the heading, Environmental Quality Inquiry, Level 2. The language was colder this time. Less posturing and more clinical, it referenced escalation protocols and behavioral review, citing his refusal to cooperate with field interviews as complicating the community compliance initiative. Beneath the legal-sounding lingo, it was unmistakable. The tone had shifted. From warning to accusation. He wasn't just resisting, they claimed. He was obstructing. He wasn't just a neighbor with a grill. He was a threat to order. James sent the letter to Carolyn within minutes. She responded with silence at first, then a single line in reply, "They're building the box." He understood what she meant. The goal wasn't to win legally. It was to isolate him socially, define him administratively, and squeeze from above. A day later, his mailbox was tagged. Not vandalized, stickered. A clean white label with a number. No explanation. No return address. He peeled it off, checked for residue, found none. But the next day, it was back. Then again, the next. Every morning, a new sticker. He changed the box. It returned on the replacement. Small, quiet, deniable. Harassment in the language of order. Then came the phone calls, not from the fake agencies, from legitimate services. His property insurance provider, a home security sales team, a utility subcontractor. All of them reaching out to confirm details about his property usage. A woman from the insurance company asked if he was aware that unregulated solid fuel systems could complicate liability coverage. She couldn't explain how that concern had been flagged. James took notes. He asked for documentation. None arrived. Carolyn explained later that informal complaints could be submitted anonymously to databases used by third-party monitoring services. If someone wanted to paint a target, they didn't need to show proof. They just had to use the right language. Potential risk, non-standard structure, volatile neighbor interactions. It didn't take evidence, just repetition. James didn't break. He adjusted. He called his insurance provider, scheduled a voluntary inspection, walked the inspector through the property, provided full documentation, and received a clean report with 0 findings of concern. He filed the report with the city's planning board. He updated the sheriff's office complaint. Then he installed a second mailbox inside the fence, locked and camera monitored. The next sticker was left on the gate. The turning point came on a Sunday morning. James was preparing to start the fire, modest, low flame, enough for 2 chicken breasts, when he noticed something off in the grill's smoke pattern. It wasn't rising cleanly. It choked slightly, then curled sharply downward before dispersing in erratic lines. It had never done that before. He shut down the fire, opened the intake chamber, and found it. Embedded in the intake vent was a narrow strip of metallic mesh coated in a gummy resin. Difficult to see unless you were looking for it. It wasn't factory standard. Someone had inserted it between uses. The substance was sticky, heat-reactive and designed to disrupt airflow, causing backdraft and smoke choking. Not only that, it could have created a fire risk, not a major one, not a blaze, but a smoke reflux hazard that could force emissions downward or cause internal ignition under the right conditions. James stood silently over the grill for a long time, not moving, not speaking. Then he put on gloves, removed the strip, sealed it in a freezer bag, labeled it by date, and placed it in his locked cabinet alongside the earlier air sensor. Then he went inside and called the fire marshal's office, not the sheriff. He explained the situation, sent photos, offered to surrender the foreign object for testing. The marshal arrived the next day, not with lights or sirens, but with calm, professional eyes and a clipboard. He inspected the grill, reviewed the mesh strip, and said quietly, "This was tampering. Someone wanted a smoke issue to occur." James didn't reply. The marshal noted everything, took the bag, and said he'd file it as part of an ongoing case. For the first time, the words "ongoing case" made their way into an official report. James didn't feel vindicated. He felt confirmed. He wasn't imagining this. He wasn't overreacting. He was under siege. And then, as if in response to his persistence, the next tactic arrived: social engineering. James came home 2 days later to find a pamphlet tucked into his door handle. Bright colors, cheerful fonts, a smiling child with a balloon. The heading read, "Neighbors for Breathing Space. Join the movement." Inside, it was less cheerful. Certain individuals in our community continue to expose vulnerable families to harmful wood smoke, despite multiple health advisories and peaceful requests for consideration. It didn't name him, but it didn't have to. It featured a diagram, clearly his property, with arrows showing hypothetical smoke drift patterns reaching nearby yards. The back page encouraged recipients to attend our meeting to support air-safe living. The meeting was scheduled 2 blocks away at a local library room. The same day the flyer arrived, James noticed 2 new lawn signs pop up on his street. Same logo, same slogan. He didn't recognize the names on the signs, but the message was clear. The campaign had gone public. Carolyn advised against attending the meeting. "They want you angry," she said. "They want you to show up, 'cause a stir. Fit the narrative." James stayed home. He grilled that night slowly, deliberately, using only charcoal. The flames burned low and blue. There was no visible smoke. And still, at 9:47 p.m., the motion light near the tree line flicked on. He walked out and found a man standing just beyond the fence, hands in his pockets, looking at the house. They locked eyes for a moment before the man turned and walked away. That week, James installed high-resolution cameras with license plate recognition. He didn't want footage to go viral. He wanted it admissible. He updated his logs. He kept grilling. Then, on a Tuesday morning, his power went out. No wind, no rain, no grid failure. Just silence. He called the utility company. They claimed a scheduled maintenance window had affected his sector. He asked for notice records. There were none sent. When power returned 2 hours later, he checked his cameras. One of them had glitched during the outage, precisely the one watching the driveway. Nothing else was missing. Nothing else touched. Just a gap. Carolyn filed a subpoena for service records. The utility deflected. "Routine update," they said. But James knew timing, and he knew how systems talk to each other in shadows. On Thursday, an SUV idled outside his gate for 16 minutes, engine running, windows up, no movement. Then it drove off. On Friday, he received a handwritten letter in his mailbox. "It's not too late to switch." Some things aren't worth it. No return address, no threat, just a suggestion. But this wasn't negotiation. This was the slow tightening of the noose. James logged it all. And still, he grilled. By the time the 6th week arrived, James no longer lived in a quiet neighborhood, at least not in the sense he had once believed it to be. The tension that had once crept in through side channels now lived openly in the air, not loud, but ever present, like a scent that clung to everything. The campaign against him had shifted from whispers and manufactured paperwork to something more precise, almost mathematical. The escalation was no longer emotional. It was procedural. His life had become a ledger of acts committed and recorded, every event slotted into one of two columns, what was provable and what was not. But even logic has a pressure point, and James felt his approaching. On a mild morning with thin sunlight and low wind, he walked to the side yard and found a new development. His water spigot had been turned on at full blast. The hose attached to it had been cut and left trailing into the dirt, which was now a soaked trench that had ruined a portion of his grass and flooded a shallow section of the garden bed. It wasn't random. It was targeted. It sent a message, just like everything else. James turned off the water, rolled up the hose, and wrote it down in the log. He didn't curse. He didn't throw things. He sat down and wrote it cleanly, quietly, methodically. But as he did, the hand holding the pen trembled slightly. That afternoon, Carolyn called him, not to discuss a new filing or respond to the latest piece of fake correspondence, but to tell him the fire marshal's lab had completed their analysis of the obstruction mesh. The resin compound used in the airflow strip had a commercial identifier. It wasn't something sold over the counter. It was a spray sealant used in HVAC systems and manufactured by a company that licensed its product only to certified contractors. That didn't provide a name, but it narrowed the field considerably. More importantly, the lab confirmed that once the mesh was heated to a certain degree, it would have released a volatile compound capable of triggering a smoke alarm from inside the house had the windows been open. That was no longer sabotage. That bordered on a chemical assault. Carolyn paused before continuing. I've submitted the report to the sheriff's office and I've notified the city attorney. This is now being reviewed as a targeted act of endangerment, not just property interference. She was calm, deliberate. James said nothing for a while. He felt the information settle over him like a thin layer of ash. It was the confirmation he didn't want but knew was coming. He wasn't just being harassed. He was being actively undermined, and it was no longer theoretical. That evening, James grilled. He didn't do it to prove a point. He did it because it was the one part of his life that had not yet been taken. He selected a single cut of meat, lit a modest fire, used a new piece of wood, mesquite, clean and dry. The flames rose steadily. The smoke climbed straight into the air, and he stood next to the grill in silence as the sun slipped behind the hills. He was halfway through his meal when the next move came. Not as a sound, not as a visitor, but as a shadow. Across the yard, near the rear fence, a new object had been placed. It was barely visible at first, just a dark shape behind the brush. But when James walked closer, he saw it clearly. A new post, freshly driven into the ground, with a small rectangular box bolted to the top. It was another sensor, sleeker, more advanced than the previous one. Its solar panel reflected the dying light of day. And it wasn't on his property. It was 2 inches beyond the line, just far enough to be on the neighbor's land, just close enough to face his grill directly. James stared at it for a long moment, then turned and walked back inside. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The trap wasn't in the device. It was in the reaction it was meant to provoke. He poured a glass of water, sat down, and dialed a number he hadn't used before. It was the contact of a private mediator, an expert Carolyn had worked with in land dispute cases. The man agreed to come out the next morning, not to mediate but to serve as a third-party witness. That would prove useful, because what happened next made witnesses essential. The following day, James awoke to find two uniformed city workers standing near the front of his property, holding a printed form and marking off points along the curb with chalk. He approached, calm but direct, and asked for the reason. They handed him a work order labeled Environmental Survey, Pathway Access Optimization. When he asked which department had issued it, they pointed to a department that, when contacted, had no record of such a request. The men weren't imposters. They were real city workers, but they were acting on a form fed through a channel they didn't question. Carolyn arrived 20 minutes later, reviewed the paperwork, and immediately filed a stay order, freezing any work within 50 feet of the property line pending legal review. It was a tactical play. Someone had triggered a service protocol to initiate a city response that appeared unrelated to James's case, but would give cover to remark his land's utility boundaries. If the work had gone forward, the sensors could have become infrastructure adjacent, and the grill, by proximity, reclassified as a hazard. The manipulation of systems was becoming more sophisticated. The enemy wasn't just Karen. It was the shadow framework she had quietly constructed, brick by bureaucratic brick. Then came the final blow, or what was meant to be the final blow. That weekend, a letter arrived by certified mail from a newly formed group calling itself Residential Order and Safety Committee, this time co-signed by a notary. The letter informed James that a public complaint had been submitted citing his grill as the source of continuous unregulated emissions, and that a formal petition had been opened to classify his property as a localized environmental disturbance zone. The language was coded, but the implication was severe. If the classification went through, even temporarily, it could restrict his right to use open-flame equipment for a period of 6 months. And once that restriction was filed, reversing it would require a city board hearing, which could take another 6 months. It wasn't punishment, it was entrapment by attrition. James read the letter once, then twice. Then he placed it on the table and stared at it until the sun shifted in the window. He understood now that this wasn't about a grill. It never had been. It was about power. Not the kind exercised by law, but the kind enforced by silence, complicity, and paperwork no one questioned. And he realized that in order to break this system, he didn't need to fight harder. He needed to make them overreach. He met with Carolyn the next morning. They spent 2 hours building a response. Not loud, not accusatory, but razor precise. They issued a counterpetition, filed through the same municipal system, citing illegal evidence gathering, targeted harassment, unlicensed sensor installation, and tampering with certified air safety documentation. Carolyn attached affidavits, witness testimony from the fire marshal, the lab report, and photos from the utility incident. Then, with James's permission, she filed a formal request for a public hearing, not to defend against the charges but to investigate the legitimacy of the environmental complaint network itself. The move was unexpected. It reversed the dynamic. Suddenly, the system Karen had built was no longer a hammer. It was a spotlight, and what it illuminated next would determine who still had power. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks after the filing. A quiet Thursday morning in a municipal building James had only entered once before, years ago, to finalize the deed on his property. Now he walked through its doors again, but under different circumstances. No longer just a homeowner, but a man who had become the unwilling center of a campaign defined by manipulation, quiet intimidation, and soft threats dressed in administrative formality. Carolyn walked beside him, calm as ever, her leather briefcase filled with evidence. They didn't bring signs. They didn't bring supporters. Just the truth, in sharp, undeniable form. The room was modest. A semicircle of city board members, a table for each party, and a thin crowd of neighbors seated in quiet rows. Among them, James spotted Karen Thatcher seated near the back in a pale blue jacket, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. She didn't look worried. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone who thought the ending had already been written. But the script had changed. The first half of the hearing focused on the original complaint, Karen's petition to designate James's property as a disturbance zone. Her representative, a man in a gray blazer with too many papers and not enough conviction, spoke in generalities, citing ongoing discomfort, community cohesion, and air quality anxieties. No hard data, no expert testimony, just phrases designed to sound reasonable, stretched thin over a foundation of assumption. The board asked a few clarifying questions, nodded, made notes. But then Carolyn stood. What followed was not dramatic. It was surgical. She introduced the sensor tampering report from the fire marshal's office, the air quality analysis, the certified insurance inspection, and a sworn statement from the environmental technician. She played the hearing tape of the call to the city after the unauthorized pathway optimization request. She distributed photos of the stickered mailbox, the manipulated utility schedule, and the strategically placed second sensor. She submitted the registered history of the neighborhood's failed governance vote years earlier, with Karen's name circled in red. And then, with composure that cut deeper than any raised voice could, she laid down the final piece. A timeline of events, showing the exact correlation between each of Karen's health complaints and James's documented compliance steps. Each one, followed by an escalation. Each attempt at accommodation met with retaliation. The pattern was undeniable. For the first time in weeks, James saw Karen move. She leaned slightly forward. Her fingers tightened just enough for the clasped hands to tremble. Not visibly, but enough. The room was silent when Carolyn finished. The board conferred briefly. Then one of the members, an older man with reading glasses and a deeply lined face, cleared his throat and spoke. He thanked both parties, cited the seriousness of the accusations, and announced that the petition against James's property was officially dismissed with prejudice. The designation request was nullified. No further environmental complaints would be accepted without verified third-party documentation. But he didn't stop there. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and continued. The board would be submitting a separate request to the city attorney's office, asking for an inquiry into the activities of the Residential Order and Safety Committee and its affiliates. The materials presented today, he said, suggested a possible misuse of process and administrative manipulation bordering on civil harassment. The board's role, he concluded, was to mediate, not to enforce the private ambitions of individuals using public systems as weapons. James said nothing as he and Carolyn walked out of the building. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just nodded once when they reached the parking lot, then looked up at the sky and took a long, slow breath. It was over. Not just the hearing, the siege, the slow, creeping war that had tried to convince him he was alone, irrational, out of line for defending something as simple as a grill, something as profound as autonomy. Over the next few days, the signs disappeared. The stickers stopped. The mailbox remained clean. James rebuilt the soaked patch of his yard, reseeded the soil, restacked the wood pile. He didn't dismantle the grill. He reinforced it. New fire brick, weather-treated ceiling. He installed a simple plaque beside it, not to commemorate the fight but to reclaim the space. It read, "Built by hand, defended by principle." Karen never spoke to him again. She remained in her house, curtains drawn, her power quietly drained. The so-called committee dissolved in silence, and no new letters arrived. James went on living, not triumphantly, not loudly, but with clarity. He grilled when he wanted. He tended his yard. He answered his mail with confidence, not caution. And when he stood beside the flame in the evening, watching the smoke rise clean and straight into the sky, he didn't think about victory. He thought about cost and worth, and about how some fires are lit not for heat or food, but to remind the world that a man's land is his word, and his word cannot be extinguished.